Everyone talks about modern box office bombs, but nobody mentions that a single film in 1980 helped dismantle one of the most storied studios in Hollywood history. The studio's parent company actually walked away with a profit. That's the kind of story the 1970s keeps hiding. Studios today absorb hundreds of millions in losses and keep operating. Back then, one wrong call could erase decades of institutional identity, and several films on this list did not just underperform, they rewrote the rules governing how Hollywood distributes money, creative control, and second chances. Let's get into it. Heaven's Gate is the production everyone cites when the conversation turns to runaway budgets, and they are not wrong to cite it. Michael Cimino arrived at United Artists in 1978 carrying the extraordinary goodwill of the deer hunter, and United Artists handed him the keys without much hesitation. He told them he could deliver his next film for $7.5 million, which United Artists bumped to $12 million, and by the time cameras finally stopped rolling, the production had consumed $44 million in nominal 1980 dollars, roughly $140 million in today's money, and that figure excludes marketing costs entirely. The film premiered in New York on November 19, 1980, to reviews so catastrophic that United Artists pulled it from theaters within days, and when a shorter cut returned to cinemas, it earned $3.5 million domestically against that $44 million spend. You would think that gap alone killed United Artists, but here is the thing, the receipts tell a more complicated story. Cimino captured approximately 1 million feet of film and presented United Artists with a 5.5-hour cut. The production employed 1,200 extras, constructed an entire period town from scratch across the Montana landscape, and ran nearly a year behind schedule. The daily pace was so glacial that John Hurt spent so long waiting around between scenes that he left the production entirely, filmed The Elephant Man for David Lynch, collected his notices, and then returned to shoot more footage. That one detail describes the whole operation more vividly than any budget spreadsheet could. The United Artists collapse that followed has hardened into myth, but the parent company Transamerica had purchased United Artists for $180 million 12 years earlier and sold it to Kirk Kerkorian's MGM for $383 million, which means they turned a substantial profit on the transaction. The decision to sell reflected corporate strategy far more than it reflected a single film's losses, and film historian Charles Elton's 2022 book makes precisely this argument, noting that the bankruptcy narrative circulated for decades without ever being accurate. Critical reassessment of the film shifted considerably over the following decades, with Martin Scorsese among its most prominent defenders, and the Criterion release of the 216-minute director's cut in 2012 gave the film the proper presentation it had never received during its initial release. The film currently holds 57% on Rotten Tomatoes, though the critical conversation around it has grown noticeably warmer over time. One footnote that almost never gets mentioned: the animal welfare controversy surrounding this production led directly to the Screen Actors Guild and the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers contractually requiring American Humane Society monitoring of animals across all film productions, a policy that remains in force today. One catastrophic shoot, one lasting industry standard. This one is almost sad because Sorcerer is genuinely a great film. William Friedkin arrived at this production after directing both The Exorcist and The French Connection, carrying the kind of credibility that should have insulated him from Catastrophe, and it protected him from absolutely nothing. Sorcerer opened on June 24, 1977, distributed jointly by Paramount and Universal. The production began with a budget of around $2.5 million and finished somewhere between $21 million and $22 million, with sources varying slightly on the precise amount. Against that spend, the film earned $5.9 million domestically and approximately $9 million worldwide. Roger Ebert estimated the film would have needed $45 to $50 million just to break even, which gives you a sense of the scale of the problem. The sequence everyone remembers involves two trucks crossing a rotting rope bridge suspended over a jungle river in a torrential rainstorm. Friedkin built that bridge for $1 million. The original river location then dried up completely, so the crew dismantled the entire structure and rebuilt it at a new site for another $1 million. Roy Scheider performed the crossing himself with no rear projection and no camera tricks. He trained to operate the truck, and he said the experience made Jaws look like a picnic, which, given how chaotic the Jaws shoot was, is saying something. What actually finished Sorcerer at the box office had nothing to do with the quality of the film. George Lucas had opened Star Wars at Mann's Chinese Theater, on May 25, 1977, 5 weeks before Sorcerer's release, and the theater had no interest in replacing a cultural phenomenon with a tense European-influenced thriller about criminals transporting unstable dynamite through a South American jungle. Audiences who might have found Sorcerer were watching Star Wars for the third time instead, and the timing was not just bad luck, it was the kind of collision that reshapes careers. Friedkin had originally pursued Steve McQueen for the lead role, but negotiations collapsed when McQueen insisted his then-wife also be cast, and Roy Scheider stepped in to deliver what most critics now consider among his finest performances. Friedkin supervised a 4K restoration that gave the film proper availability for the first time in decades. After William Friedkin passed away on August 7, 2023, the restoration stands as the definitive version of a film that deserved a far better debut. The title turned out to be a prediction rather than a description. Raise the Titanic opened on August 1, 1980, adapted from Clive Cussler's best-selling novel from 1976, and it sank with the kind of efficiency that leaves producers staring at walls. The budget landed somewhere between $35 million and $40 million in nominal figures, and sources conflict on the exact number. The film earned a total worldwide gross of $7 million, with the opening weekend pulling in $1,615,000 from 167 theaters. Producer Lou Grade's response has become one of the most quoted lines in Hollywood financial history. He said, "It would be cheaper to lower the Atlantic." That is the kind of line that ends investor relationships and begins long silences at dinner parties. The centerpiece of the production was a 55-foot scale model of the Titanic, constructed at enormous cost and housed in a water tank in Malta. It was an impressive physical achievement for 1980. The production operated on the belief that watching a ship rise from the ocean floor would be sufficient reason to buy a ticket. Audiences concluded otherwise with considerable conviction. Critics noted that the drama surrounding the model was substantially less convincing than the model itself, which is a specific kind of embarrassment. Clive Cussler's reaction was unambiguous. He refused to license further film adaptations of his novels for 25 years. Sahara finally reached cinemas in 2005. The Malta model was abandoned after production wrapped. A storm damaged it in 2003, and it has remained rusting in that same location ever since. Producer Lou Grade effectively stepped back from film production following this failure. The film currently holds 38% on Rotten Tomatoes from 8 reviews. John Barry's musical score collected widespread praise and is regarded as among the finest compositions of his career. In other words, the best thing about Raise the Titanic is the part you could have listened to without buying a ticket. Steven Spielberg had made Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and the studio's response was to give him $35 million in nominal $1979 and a cast that included John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, John Candy, Christopher Lee, Toshiro Mifune, Robert Stack, and Ned Beatty, with a screenplay by Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale and a story contribution from John Milius. That is a staggering concentration of talent for a single room. 1941 released on December 14th, 1979, and earned somewhere between $90 million and $94.9 million worldwide in nominal figures, with sources disagreeing slightly on the precise total. You might think that sounds like a success, but the standard rule of thumb holds that a film needs to earn roughly twice its production budget to break even, once distribution, marketing, and theatrical splits are accounted for, which means a $35 million production cost and $90 million worldwide start to look considerably thinner under scrutiny. Critical reception was unkind. The comedy read as overwhelming rather than funny, spectacular in scale but hollow at its center, and Spielberg later acknowledged the film had too much of everything and not enough story underneath any of it. The aftermath is where this story becomes genuinely interesting. Spielberg's next 2 productions were Raiders of the Lost Ark and E.T. the Extraterrestrial, suggesting the stumble recalibrated something important in how he approached a project. Zemeckis and Gale channeled whatever they learned from the experience into Back to the Future. Viewed from a sufficient distance, 1941 looks less like a failure and more like the controlled crash that made everything following it possible, though that reframing would have been cold comfort in the Columbia boardroom during January 1980. Francis Ford Coppola had The Godfather, The Godfather Part 2, and Apocalypse Now behind him when he spent $27 million making a musical that earned $638,000 at the box office. That number is not a typo and the comma is in the right place. Coppola's own American Zoetrope studio funded One from the Heart, which opened in February 1982 and carried ambitions that were, in the most generous possible framing, considerable. He reconstructed a faithful recreation of McCarran International Airport on a soundstage which alone communicates something about the scale of the undertaking, and he deployed a pioneering hybrid process combining video and film stock during production, pushing the boundaries of what filmmaking technology could achieve at the time. The audience for this particular experiment turned out to be very small indeed. Cinematographer Vittorio Storaro's work on the film has been written about admiringly for decades, and Tom Waits earned an Academy Award nomination for his score, which establishes that genuine artistry was present throughout the production. What the film failed to attract was anyone willing to pay to watch it. The financial damage extended well beyond the box office run. American Zoetrope filed for bankruptcy in 1992, and the studio never recovered the momentum it had accumulated through the 1970s. Coppola spent years directing commercial projects to service the debt the single film generated. And the irony of one of cinema's most celebrated directors spending a decade working his way back from a musical is the kind of detail that doesn't quite fit any simple narrative about artistic ambition. Peter Bogdanovich had directed The Last Picture Show and Paper Moon, and he held a position near the top of Hollywood's director hierarchy when he released At Long Last Love in 1975. The film was a 1930s-style Cole Porter musical, featuring Burt Reynolds, Sybil Shepherd, and Madeline Kahn. Bogdanovich insisted that every musical performance be captured live on set with no post-production dubbing or vocal enhancement of any kind. The budget reached $6 million in nominal 1975 against an estimated gross of $1.5 million, with that box office figure sourced from a single source and carrying corresponding uncertainty. The critical response arrived with a force that Bogdanovich apparently had not anticipated. His reaction was to take out personal advertisements and trade publications apologizing directly to audiences. That actually occurred, and it suggests the reviews were devastating enough to warrant a public response. The live recording concept reflected a genuine love for the classic Hollywood musical, and a real desire to capture the spontaneous energy of live performance. The practical problem was that live vocals recorded on a film set without post-production enhancement lack the warmth of a proper studio recording, and the gap between what Bogdanovich was reaching for and what actually arrived on screen was audible to everyone who bought a ticket. At Long Last Love closed out Bogdanovich's run as a top-tier director with a thoroughness that the industry rarely applies and almost never reverses. He continued making films, some of them genuinely accomplished, but the position he had held between 1971 and 1973 never returned. Hollywood's institutional memory for a specific public failure operates on a very long timeline. Myra Breckinridge is the earliest entry here, and in certain respects the most revealing of the entire list. Released in 1970 and adapted from Gore Vidal's satirical 1968 novel, the film represents 20th Century Fox operating under the conviction that they had correctly identified a cultural moment and positioned themselves to profit from it. Easy Rider and Midnight Cowboy had demonstrated that counterculture audiences would pay to see challenging, transgressive material, and Fox wanted to occupy that space with a film starring Raquel Welch and Mae West, directed by Michael Cimino, and carrying an X rating at release. The budget reached $5.385 million in nominal figures against a domestic gross of about $3 million, with those figures drawn from a single source and warranting appropriate caution, though no version of the accounting makes the result look acceptable. What Fox miscalculated was the difference between transgression that carries genuine meaning for its audience and transgression assembled a spectacle by a studio that had observed a cultural movement from a distance without fully understanding its internal logic. Easy Rider connected because it expressed something real about the people watching it, while Myra Breckinridge was a corporate approximation of a sensibility the studio admired without comprehending, executed with the specific confidence that only comes from not knowing what you don't know. No. The film received a rating reduction to R at some point after release, which satisfied neither the audience it had originally targeted nor any alternative audience that might have replaced them. It stands as one of the more instructive examples of a major studio watching a genuine cultural shift occur and then misreading every available signal about how to respond to it effectively. The market for challenging cinema existed in 1970. This particular film simply wasn't it. The pattern threading through all 7 of these productions is consistent. A studio or filmmaker achieves extraordinary success, the industry removes structural guardrails in response, and the filmmaker then discovers at considerable expense that those guardrails had a function. Heaven's Gate didn't dismantle the auteur era by itself. Sorcerer, 1941, One from the Heart, At Long Last Love, Raise the Titanic, and Myra, Breckinridge all contributed to a collective shift that pulled power back toward the studios and away from directors who had been given more freedom than any institutional structure could safely sustain. Many of the films on this list are now correctly regarded as genuinely worthwhile, and several of them are outright classics that simply arrived in the wrong circumstances. The ones that never recover their reputation still tell you more about how Hollywood operates than most of the era's successes manage to, because failure leaves the underlying mechanics visible in ways that success tends to obscure. The pattern of studios removing guardrails after a hit, watching the following project spiral, and then overcorrecting for a decade afterward repeats across every era of Hollywood history. We track it here.